Unabashed.
The most unpredictable.
Becomes a headline.
The most volatile.
Outrageous behavior.
Unsubstantiated narratives.
A battle of personalities.
Welcome to a special post-election edition of Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. After 7 long weeks of campaigning, yesterday we finally learned the outcome of the 2019 Indian general elections, and what an outcome it was. In a stunning repeat of the 2014 electoral triumph, the BJP of Prime Minister Narendra Modi decisively won re-election, earning a second consecutive single-party majority in the Lok Sabha. According to preliminary results, the BJP-led NDA won a whopping 350 seats, while the opposition Congress-led United Progressive Alliance won just 92 seats. Non-aligned regional parties won another 100-odd seats or so. Today we're going to have a special conversation, just having a kind of a quick take about what happened, sort of election postmortem. Next week we'll have a more considered conversation where I'm going to be in the hot seat and our executive producer Lauren Dueck is going to be in my usual seat. But joining me today to discuss the results of the landmark poll is Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Tanvi, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So it's really hard to know where we even begin because this was such a stunning rout, triumph, shellacking, thumping, I don't know what the right word is, but maybe we could just start by putting this election in sort of historical context. You know, where do you think this fits in as we look at the broad swath of India's post-independence electoral journey?
Yeah, the word historic gets overused these days, not just in India, but everywhere. Everything is historic. This is historic. Now, we can decide whether this is a turning point in and of itself, or that this reflects a turning point in Indian politics and society and economy, but it is significant. No party other than the Congress party has won back-to-back majorities ever in Indian election history. And I mean, just the fact that we haven't seen back-to-back majorities since 1984, and the journey of the party, the BJP, which in that election in 1984 had 2 seats and is now over 300, tells you a story that is not just about kind of India or Indian politics, but also says that 2014, the last election, it wasn't an aberration, it wasn't an exception, it wasn't about anti-incumbency, but is perhaps another oft-used phrase, the new normal. The Prime Minister and his party have used the term New India over the last few years. That was a phrase originally used by Nehru and Sardar Patel in the early years after independence. And it's clear that Modi and his party are also quite reflective of the change in what that new India constitutes from the early years of independence and most of India's history to the more recent years.
You know, we had this debate in 2014 amongst political scientists about whether we were entering a sort of new party system. Because from 1989 to 2014, we were in this era of coalition politics, what people called the third party system. So the first was Congress dominance. The second was Congress dominance in Delhi, but a loss of dominance at the states. The third was a system where you really had no central gravitational pull or force in Indian politics. Now, 2014 looked like the start of a new era, but I think for many people, they said, well, it was a perfect storm of anti-incumbency, of economic malaise, of a kind of weak incumbent that was fragmented, and as such a strong, charismatic opposition leader in terms of Narendra Modi, that it would be hard for lightning to strike twice. Now, when lightning strikes twice, you've got to ask if the climate has changed fundamentally, right? And I think, to your point, I think we can conclusively say now that we're in a fourth-party system where the BJP is certainly the pole around which politics revolves. Now, it's hard to know, you know, when we transition from the fourth to the fifth party system, right? These things are typically only discernible when you kind of look backwards. In the coming weeks and months, you know, election observers, political scientists, all of us are going to be pouring through the data to try to make sense of how this victory came to pass. We don't have the benefit of considered hard data right now, for the most part. But to your mind, what do you think is the sort of responsible for this historic triumph?
I mean, at this stage, it's hard not to say that the one-word answer to that is Modi. People have argued, and it's true, right? There's some combination. Obviously, it's not just Modi alone. In very Modi style, I can say there are lots of M's responsible for this, right? The machine, the message, the media, money. But it's from what we do know from kind of early surveys, etc. It's people voting for Modi and what he represents. People have talked about kind of different reasons for that. That he is constantly everywhere for people. He's actually touched their lives in many places. You've talked about kind of in some of your articles about how that last mile delivery of services has been improved and very much associated with him. But also in terms of that he is reflective of the kind of India that perhaps a lot of people want to see, or that they see in himself a kind of much more accessible figure, ironically for somebody who's not very accessible in terms of media stuff, but I think in terms of people think of him as much more relatable. From the sense that, he came from kind of, he's not a dynast, that he came from kind of humble background, so to speak, and is now the Prime Minister of India. And I think even though the message in this campaign wasn't very aspirational as it was, at least except for maybe on the national security and international side, though that wasn't kind of very aspirational, I think he still embodies that aspiration for many people, and they're willing to give him another go, so to speak, in a way that the economic news might not have suggested.
Pratap Bhanu Mehta had a piece in this morning's Indian Express where he said, any genuine election analysis or postmortem has to basically only have two words, which is Narendra Modi. That it's hard really to come up with a theory of the case that doesn't revolve centrally around him and his stature. I found one of the most interesting data points to come out of the CSDS post-election survey, about which we'll hear much more in the coming weeks, is that 32% of people who voted for the BJP said they would have voted for another party if Prime Minister Modi was not their candidate. Well, it tells you something about the centrality of his role. I had written a piece several weeks ago for the Washington Post saying voters were looking for an excuse to vote for Narendra Modi, and I got a lot of pushback about that word excuse on Twitter, and perhaps it was kind of inelegant. But what I meant to say is people like him. People think that he's decisive. People think that he's incorruptible. People think that he has clean intent. People think that he operates with the national interest at heart. And so therefore, that's really what's on the ballot for them, so to speak, is Modi's leadership. My friend and fellow political scientist Nilanjan Sarkar had a nice tweet yesterday where he said, typically as political analysts, we look at issues and we say, okay, well, the economy is going this direction, so how is that going to refract in people's electoral choices? In this case, it looks like it's the opposite way. People looked at the leader and then they found reasons to build a case for him, right? Whether it was Balakot, whether it was social service delivery, whether it was, again, kind of muscularity or ideology or Hindutva, right? It could be many of these issues. Looking back, obviously, it's hard to say anything with 100% confidence. You were in India a couple of weeks ago. Do you think that the events with respect to kind of India-Pakistan tensions were a sort of critical inflection point? I mean, do we know enough to say that that really was a turning point in this election?
I don't know if we know enough to say it kind of definitively. I think what we do know is that what it did do, which is, for one, it did shift the conversation. It shifted the narrative. Now, it's hard to say, were people going to vote this way anyway? And like you said, it just was another kind of reason. But I do think what they managed to do as a party, and particularly the Prime Minister, is by keeping the focus on kind of national security, it also fit in with a lot of themes he was kind of trying to run on: strong leadership, improving India's image on the world stage, showing strength. And, this idea of him being the watchman, the guardian, the chowkidar, for India. And this fit into kind of both the hope and the fear aspects. Look, I am showing strength. Fear that, listen, if not me, who? And I think so it also kind of highlighted that, look, the opposition doesn't really have anybody, so there is no alternative. So I think what it did manage to do is very much shift the momentum and narrative from what we saw after the state elections, where the Congress had made serious gains. And it also fit in very much with the kind of message that the BJP was putting out there. So I do think I don't know if this alone would have kind of turned people's minds. What I think one of the things we'll have to kind of figure out is how much was it that it sucked up all the kind of energy in the room, reminded people of these national security issues. It's quite unusual for these things to actually matter in elections. But I do think one of the things we'll have to figure out is, like you said, did it give people a permission slip? Or were they going to do this anyway, and that just kind of made sure that that was the direction people's votes went in?
I think it's worth pointing out that even prior to the election, some of the pre-election surveys, going back to the CSDS survey, that's a useful one because we can make pre and post comparisons, had projected a BJP victory. Now, they had not projected the magnitude, but they had found that the NDA would likely get a majority or close to a majority. And I think one of the things that we haven't been very good at in India is really understanding what we call in America campaign effects, right? So in other words, we know that up to a quarter of voters decide very late in the day who they're going to vote for. We know that campaigns, particularly for general elections, which run over 6 or 7 weeks, right, do generate a kind of hava or momentum. And I think one of the things that we're going to be dissecting for months, if not years, is, what role kind of campaign played. Balakot was a piece. The nomination of Pragya Singh Thakur, could be another. Now, thinking about sort of who had a good day yesterday, obviously the BJP, Narendra Modi, Amit Shah, that's sort of obvious. Let's leave that to a side. Who else would you point to, Tanvi, in terms of really kind of making a positive mark on May 23rd?
So I think one of them is kind of Jagan Reddy and the YSR Congress Party. They came, the fact that not only did they kind of essentially win, 22 out of 25 seats in the Lok Sabha, but also won kind of the state elections. I mean, you've often pointed out that Indian voters are very smart and are able to kind of make that split choice where they'll vote for one party in state elections, one party in kind of Lok Sabha, or show the momentum. I think we saw a little bit of that in Orissa, for example. But I do think, the YSR are making a mark and has shown kind of that he is now a serious contender amongst the southern regional parties. I think the other kind of winner for me, and I've been watching kind of female turnout very closely, and one of the interesting things for me is, and I don't know if this was before final numbers came in, but one of the deputies in the election commission, Sarah pointed out that the gap in turnout of women and men, it was 9% in 2009. It's gone down to 0.4%. In some states like Bihar and others, women out-turned out, I guess, men. This is significant, and it's going to mean that, Modi's clearly targeted female voters, but I think this is now, if women continue to turn out in these numbers, is going to be something all political parties are going to have to factor in.
Two statistics I found interesting is that according to data put out by the Trivedi Center at Ashoka University, 8.8% of candidates this time, there are more than 8,000 candidates, were women. Now, that was a modest increase on what we saw last time around. 14% of the eventual winners, which is an all-time record, were women. Now, again, you could say 14% is a pretty low number, but we are at least seeing some positive momentum. I would nominate two others in the kind of good day category. One is the DMK, which did very well, winning 23 seats in the state of Tamil Nadu. They had been in the opposition, really kind of in the wilderness. They had suffered their own leadership transition, just like the ruling ADMK, which was virtually wiped out. They are well positioned, I think, now to do quite well in the next Tamil Nadu assembly elections. And so this is a kind of a striking comeback for a party that seemed to be on the ropes. The other is the man who has 9 lives, Nitish Kumar, who has had more transformations than we can possibly count. He had been against Modi, then he had been with the NDA, then he was out of the NDA, then he was nowhere. Last time, I think, only winning 2 seats in the Lok Sabha. And now he is back with the NDA, winning, I think, 16 seats. I should mention these numbers we're quoting here are still provisional because they only finalized the data early this morning, India time. This puts him in a fairly good position in the state. Again, I think for now he seems to be on quite a good equation with the BJP. Although who knows if that might change in the months to come. Now going to the kind of election losers, again, leaving the Congress because we'll have plenty to say about the Congress later. Who do you think had a bad day on the 23rd?
So it's hard not to quote one of the people who I think is kind of had a person who had a pretty bad day, Mamata Banerjee, who said all losers are not losers. But that's kind of that's trying very hard on the spin. And the fact that the BJP went from 18%, vote share to 40%, they're nipping at her heels as the assembly election for the next assembly elections, and I suspect that will be one of Amit Shah's priorities over the next, people are talking about a ministerial post, but I think for the party that will be the fact that they're within kind of winning distance from that state. I think, that is going to made huge gains in terms of number of seats as well. So I think she is one of the losers. I think the communists, it's interesting how, not only do they fall from like 23% to 6 to 7% vote share in West Bengal, but in Kerala, where the Congress party essentially kind of wiped them out. And so, from just kind of, not that long ago where they were kind of the key coalition partners for the UPA, threatening things like the US-India nuclear deal, etc., to essential wilderness.
This will be debated, but we know Rahul Gandhi lost his seat in Amethi with the longtime pocket borough of the Gandhi family in Uttar Pradesh. He won his seat in Kerala and Wayanad, and that may have been one of the few smart decisions that Congress made, because people are arguing that this at least could possibly contributed to the Congress party doing so well in Kerala, given the time and attention that he gave to that part of the country. I think you're absolutely right on the left. Two others, I think, which had bad days. One is just sort of generally the number of parties who we associate with kind of Mandal politics, right? So these are political parties that really came to the fore in the wake of the Mandal Commission, which granted backward caste reservation. So whether it's the RJD of Lalu Prasad Yadav, the Samajwadi Party of Akhilesh Yadav, even Mayawati, who did quite well compared to 2014, where the BSP won 0 seats, but still they were really trounced to the SP-BSP alliance in Uttar Pradesh. And the last I would mention is the Aam Aadmi Party of Arvind Kejriwal. I mean, a pretty humbling result for them to end up with just one member of parliament, even though they have seemed rather entrenched in the state level in Delhi. It was a repeat of the BJP sweep in Delhi's 7 Lok Sabha seats. And I think a lot of people asking questions about what the future is of this, what seemed at one point as maybe a third possible national alternative. We seem light years away from that possibility. Let me just end the conversation with a question to you about the Congress. And this is a question that seems like we ask after many elections, which is anything going to change?
So, when we talked about kind of the significance of this election, they didn't match their lowest total, which was in 2014. But if you think about it, by 2024, this is the longest the Congress party would have been out of power ever. So 10 years out of power. That is significant in terms of, as you've talked about at the center, that means a certain amount of, fundraising ability, power, patronage, but also kind of, you get out of experience in terms of your bench strength. It's hard to build kind of your organization from that point. But I do think, does anything change? I think if it doesn't, then we will see kind of this dominance of the BJP perhaps continue. I think what they can do, a lot of people are talking about leadership at the central level. I'll leave that to people, prognosticators. But I do think what they can do if they really want to make a change is take one of these states, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and really show what they can do. So they can show what their alternative would look like. Perhaps, and this brings up the question of whether they made a mistake not appointing somebody like Sachin Pilot, a next generation politician who had a lot to do with their win in Rajasthan. as chief minister. And so I think whether it's him, whether it's Ashok Gehlot, showing, if they're saying they're different, then showing what that looks like. Because otherwise it will be very hard to convince people, unless, we see some sort of just loss of confidence in this new government that Prime Minister Modi will form. I think it's very hard to say how you can really start to make inroads unless you really show that you're different and have that kind of leadership and executive ability.
So count me skeptical that we're going to see any big shifts, although I suppose anything's possible in Indian politics. I mean, this is not a party known for grand introspection or self-reflection historically. And I think that there are two built-in structural features of Indian politics which also may prevent them from introspection. Number one is that, again, despite a second consecutive loss, they still have around 19 or 20% of the vote, right? So that seems to be a certain floor that they have not dipped below. The second is that there are enough bipolar states where there's two-party competition between the BJP and the Congress, such that if there's any anti-incumbency or movement away from the BJP, the Congress is the only vehicle, really, a repository for those opposition votes. And until and unless a third party emerges in states like Gujarat or Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan or Himachal or Uttarakhand or, all the other places where we see this kind of two-party political dynamic, there'll be enough for the Congress perhaps to sort of feed off of. So we'll have to wait and see whether or not some of the initial frustration that has been let out on Rahul Gandhi is going to continue. We'll have yet another, I'm sure, after-action report that the Congress Party will put together in the coming days and weeks. Tanvi, thanks so much for joining us. I just want to give a slight plug. We're about to step foot over next door to your place to do a post-election postmortem. And will video from that event be available online?
Yes, it should be available fairly soon online on the Brookings YouTube channel, but I suspect we'll all be tweeting it out as well.
So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And so we'll be back next week at our regular scheduled Wednesday time when Lauren Dueck will put me in the hot seat to talk more about the 2019 elections. Grant the Masha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, grantthemasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck's our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.